Hi, my name is Tara. I'm the senior supervisor here at Snowflake School. I'd like to start just by welcoming you to Snowflake School. We're really excited to have you join the team. We will be running today some of our induction package through recorded trainings. There's no need for you to take down any notes during these trainings, as we will share the slides with you and make sure that they're available for you. I would suggest that if during the recorded trainings you do have any questions that you would like to clarify with either myself or one of the supervisors in the school, that you just jot those down and we'll make sure that there is a time allocated where we can answer any of the questions or go over any of the information that we have covered in the recorded trainings, and that you'd just like some clarification on, or any questions at all. We'll also be running in the induction package some workshops that will allow us to kind of role play implementing some of the procedures and protocols, and just generally give us a chance to kind of practice teaching how we do in Snowflake School. You'll also be receiving one-to-one training with your supervisor as well, and this is going to be on an ongoing basis. Some of the trainings that we'll be going through will be an introduction to applied behavior analysis, verbal behavior. We'll also be delving into what we call pairing and manding in our second training. We'll be covering the functions of behavior and how we manage challenging behavior in Snowflake School. We'll also be taking a look at an introduction to intensive trial teaching and also an introduction to natural environment teaching. So we'll get started today with our introduction to applied behavior analysis and verbal behavior. Just an outline of the objectives that we're going to be covering today. So we'll be taking a look at what is applied behavior analysis, what are the basic features of ABA. We'll also be looking at some of the basic principles of ABA, and that will include reinforcement, punishment, extinction. We'll be delving into what is verbal behavior, and then we'll be looking at some of the verbal operants. So that includes mand, tact, echoic, and intraverbal. And we'll also be looking at what is listener responding. So we've just got three definitions here of what is applied behavior analysis. So ABA is the design and implementation and evaluation of environmental modifications to produce socially significant improvement in human behavior. Okay, so ABA includes the use of direct observation, measurement, and functional analysis of the relations between the environment and behavior. So ABA is a scientific approach for discovering environmental variables that reliably influence socially significant behavior, and for developing a technology of behavior change that takes practical advantage of these discoveries. So what's really important here out of these definitions is that we are a science. We look to the environment, we observe behavior, we use direct observation, measurement, data to look at what are the variables that are influencing socially significant behavior, okay? And we look at how we can modify those different variables in order to create meaningful behavior change. So ABA is based on the fact that an individual's behavior is determined by the past and also current environmental events, in conjunction with organic variables such as their genetic endowment and ongoing physiological variables. Okay, so in ABA, we focus on treating behavioral difficulties by changing the individual's environment, rather than focusing on variables that are at least presently beyond our direct access. Okay, so it's an evidence-based method of examining and changing what people say and do. Okay, so just some more definitions there. Some of you might be familiar with the article by Bearwolf and Risley, which is called Some Current Dimensions in Applied Behavior Analysis, and this was written in 1968. They identified 7 features or dimensions that are essential to ABA. So these 7 dimensions include applied, behavioral, analytical, technological, conceptually systematic, effective, and generality. And we'll delve into what each of these mean on the next slide. So, an explanation of what these different features are. So, when we're talking about applied, we mean that we're focusing on socially significant behavior. Okay, so that's going to be behavior that's important to the individual and also important to those people who are in direct contact with the individual on a daily basis. So, things that maybe might be affecting the individual being able to access learning or access the community, or perhaps behavior that is actually stopping them from accessing these type of environments, or is potentially a harm to themselves or to other people. Okay. When we talk about behavioral, we're focusing on observable, objective measurement of behavior. Okay, that's really important. So we need to be able to observe and we need to be able to measure the behavior that we are looking to change. So analytical, we're demonstrating functional relationships. Okay, so we're looking at, are the changes that we're making to the environment directly affecting the behaviors that we are looking at. Technological means that all procedures implemented are described in such detail that someone else could replicate the implementation. So this is very important in Snowflake School. You'll become very familiar with our different procedures and protocols, and particularly when these procedures and protocols are individualized for one of our learners. It's very important that we describe all of our procedures in such a way that anyone who's coming to implement them is able to understand them very clearly and implement them in the same way for consistency. When we're talking about conceptually systematic, we're utilizing procedures based upon principles of behavior analysis. Okay, so that's really important as well, that we're keeping up to date and we're making sure that we are using the principles, which we'll be talking about later on in this presentation. When we talk about effective, we're talking about demonstrating socially significant behavior change through objective measurement. Okay. Generality, then, we're looking that we're producing behavior change across behaviors, people, and or settings. So the first basic principle that we're going to be covering today is a process in which a behavior is strengthened, and that's called reinforcement. So reinforcement is a really, really core, important principle of ABA that you'll hear us talking about all of the time in Snowflake School. When we're talking about reinforcement, as I said, it's a process in which a behavior is strengthened. Okay, so when we're talking about a behavior being strengthened, that might be in terms of the frequency, so how many times the behavior is occurring, the rate, the duration, so how long the behavior is occurring for, the intensity of the behavior, or other dimensions that might increase or persist. Okay, so this is as a function of an event that occurred as a consequence of or contingent on the response. Okay, so there are natural reinforcers and there are also planned reinforcers. So natural reinforcers are just things that changes to the environment that naturally happen as a result of a behavior that then strengthens that behavior or makes that behavior more likely to occur in the future. Okay. So why do we use reinforcement? So it's the fuel to behavior change. Okay, so it's a fundamental biological process that drives and supports behavior. So there's two different types of reinforcement, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So when we talk about positive and negative in terms of reinforcement, we're not talking about necessarily good or bad. We're simply talking about whether something is added to or taken away from the environment. Okay, so if we think about positive being a plus and negative being a minus, this will help us kind of remember which one is which. So, positive reinforcement is when a stimulus is added to the environment following a behavior. So, that then increases the likelihood of behavior occurring in the future. Okay, so the really important thing to remember here is that positive reinforcement is when a stimulus is added to the environment. Okay. We'll go through some specific examples in the slides that are coming up. Negative reinforcement then is when a stimulus is removed following a behavior that then increases the likelihood of behavior occurring in the future. Okay, so when we're talking about reinforcement, behavior is always being either maintained or strengthened in some way. Okay, so here's some examples of positive reinforcement. So something is being added to the environment that is then making the behavior more likely to occur in the future. So our first example, a child is told to clean the living room. He cleans the living room and then is allowed to play video games. So have a little think about what is added to the environment in this example. Our next example is a girl brushes her hair in the morning before school and then receives a compliment at school about her hair. And then she brushes her hair more often in the future. So again, have a little think about what is it that's being added to the environment in this example. Our third example, a woman eats one chip and the chip tastes delicious. So the woman eats more chips. The family dog walks into the kitchen whenever someone is cooking, and the family members occasionally give the dog a piece of food. So, what's really important in order for us to actually identify whether something is reinforcement or not is whether the behavior is strengthened in the future. So, is the person more likely to engage in this behavior in the future? If they are, then we know that this is reinforcement. Okay, so here are some examples of negative reinforcement. So your hands are sticky, so you wash your hands. Your hands are no longer sticky, and next time your hands are sticky, you're more likely to wash them. So have a little think here in terms of negative reinforcement. So what is it that's being taken away from the environment? So in this example, it's the stickiness. Okay, so your hands are sticky. You wash your hands in order to get rid of the stickiness. The stickiness is removed. And the next time when your hands are sticky, you're more likely to wash them. Okay, so our second example, it's a Monday morning commute on the Central Line. There's someone talking really loud. So you put your headphones on, and now all you hear is your favorite podcast. Okay. Again, so have a little think about what is it that's taken away from the environment that makes you more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. Our third example, a child has a toothache. So his dad gives him some paracetamol and the pain subsides. So next time his tooth hurts, he asks his dad for paracetamol. Sally's arm itches, she scratches it, and the itch goes away. So these are all great examples of negative reinforcement. So something is taken away from the environment following a behavior that makes it more likely that that person is going to engage in that behavior again in the future. So we have a little active student responding question, or ASR, about reinforcement. So Amy had to be at a job interview early on Monday morning. She put on her best suit, put on her makeup, and walked out the door into a thunderstorm. She opened her umbrella to escape from the rain. She made sure to bring her umbrella with her more often in the future. So what is this an example of? Is it A, positive reinforcement, B, negative reinforcement, C, positive punishment, or D, negative punishment? Yeah, so it is negative reinforcement. Okay, so by opening the umbrella, she's actually removed the rain from her immediate environment. Okay, so what was taken away from her environment was the rain. And the behavior that's been strengthened is making sure that she brings her umbrella so that she can use her umbrella when it's likely to rain in the future. Okay. So our second basic principle that we're going to be covering today is punishment. Okay. So when we talk about punishment in ABA, we're not necessarily talking about it in the way that it's used in everyday life. Okay, so when we talk about punishment, we're talking about anything that happens after a behavior that's likely to weaken that behavior or reduce that behavior. Okay, so punishment is a process in which a behavior is weakened, and again, when we're talking about it being weakened, we might be talking about either the frequency, the rate, the duration, the intensity, or some other dimension. Okay, that should say decrease, sorry. As a function of an event that occurred as a consequence or contingent on the response. Okay, so just like reinforcement, there are two types of punishment. There is positive and negative. And just like with reinforcement, we're not necessarily talking about good and bad here. Again, we're talking about simply whether something is added to or removed from the environment. So positive punishment is when a stimulus is added to the environment following a behavior that makes the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future that that decreases the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future. Negative punishment is when the stimulus is removed from the environment following a behavior that then decreases the likelihood of behavior occurring in the future. So the important things to take away here is that when we're talking about punishment, we're talking about something that's either added to or taken away from the environment that makes behavior less likely to occur in the future. So when we're talking about punishment, there are some ethical guidance in terms of using the principle of punishment. And the Board Association of Behavior Analysts guidance says that practitioners should exhaust all reinforcement strategies before using punishment to change the behavior. So decades of research and empirical studies have clearly shown that it's always best to rely primarily on reinforcement to bring about a change in behavior rather than punishment. So you will see that in Snowflake that we will always use reinforcement and we don't use punishment. If we were to ever use punishment, this would be as a very, very last resort when we have exhausted all other reinforcement strategies. And this would only be under the guidance of a BCBA and also obviously with permission from parents in relation to any protocol that we would use. But as I said, this is something that we don't use that often. Punishment has been shown to evoke a few unwanted side effects. I won't go into them in too much detail, but some of those might be Aggression, anger, retaliation, so an emotional response, escape, damaged relationship, or harm to rapport building process or behavioral contrast. So, like I said, I won't go into it in too much detail, but just so you're aware that in Snowflake, we will exhaust all reinforcement strategies before we would ever move on to looking at any punishment. Okay. So, moving on to some examples of positive punishment. So, our first example, a worker at a computer company is found surfing the internet during downtime rather than checking inventory. His boss calls him into his office and gives the worker a verbal scolding. So, the worker is less likely to surf the internet during downtime at work. So, in this example here, have a little think about what is added to the environment that then makes it less likely for this individual to engage in this behavior in the future. Our second example, at a customer service center, a worker is found being rude to customers on the phone. The worker is then sent down to the HR department and given extra training on phone etiquette. So again, try to identify what is added to the environment that makes it positive punishment. During a lecture, a student starts texting their friend secretly. The teacher sees the texting and gives the student detention for breaking the rule about no texting in class. So again, what is added to the environment? Here we have some examples of negative punishment. So every time I'm late to work, my boss docks my pay by £20. My behavior of arriving late decreases in the future. So in these examples here, we're looking for what is removed from the environment. Okay, so what's taken away that makes your behavior less likely to occur in the future. Our second example, a teenager has a curfew of 10 p.m. She misses her curfew by 10 minutes. Her parents take away the Bluetooth speaker in her room for 3 days. So again, what is taken away from the environment? Third example, a teen answers his phone in the classroom, interrupting the teacher. The teacher takes away his phone for the rest of the day. And our last example of negative punishment, at a customer service center, a worker isn't answering enough phone calls, so the boss calls the worker into his office and demotes his pay for his bad performance. So again, what is taken away from the environment? So we've got another ASR here on punishment. So which of the following procedures leads to a decrease in future frequency of behavior? Is it A, positive punishment, B, negative punishment, C, positive reinforcement, D, A and B, or E, A and C? And the answer is A and B. So, of course, if we're looking at a procedure that's decreasing the future frequency of behavior, we know straight away that that's going to be punishment. Okay, so punishment is always referring to a decrease in the future frequency of behavior. It could be positive or negative. This question didn't specify whether something was being added to the environment or taken away. So it could be A and B. Okay, so here's a nice little diagram just in terms of positive and negative reinforcement. Okay, so if we have a look at the top left square here, so the plus stands for positive and the or is for reinforcement. So in terms of positive reinforcement, if it's reinforcement, we know that there's going to be an increase in behavior. And positive means that a stimulus is added. if we move over here to the top right box, the minus here means negative, okay, or taken away. So this means that a stimulus is removed from the environment, but it also still means that there's an increase in behavior because it's reinforcement. Okay, if we move down to the bottom left, here is our positive punishment. So again, just the same as reinforcement, the plus means positive, so something is added to the environment, but because it's punishment, we're going to see a decrease in behavior. And if we move over here to the bottom right, we can see that the minus here means negative reinforcement, so a stimulus is removed from the environment. Okay, so our third basic principle that we're going to be covering today is called extinction. So extinction is the process whereby the reinforcement that was previously delivered following a behavior is withheld and is no longer available. So this results in the behavior being weakened, decreasing, and or stopping occurring altogether. So what's really important here is that the behavior has to be previously reinforced, okay? And that reinforcement is no longer provided for that behavior. That is extinction. So again, just as we were talking about with punishment, there might be some unwanted side effects of extinction. We won't go into it again in too much detail, but just so you're aware, there might be what we call an extinction burst, which is increased behavior before the behavior goes away. There might also be something that is called spontaneous recovery. So the behavior might come back for a brief time with no apparent reason. There also might be a chance that when someone is employing an extinction procedure, that some desirable behaviors are sometimes accidentally ignored and may cease. Okay, but we won't worry about that too much. What's really important and the takeaway from this is that extinction is when reinforcement that was previously provided for a behavior is withheld for that behavior. Okay, so here's some examples of extinction. So every time Tom signs chocolate, Smarties are no longer delivered. So over time, Tom signs chocolate less and less. Okay, so Tom is signing chocolate. Okay, and previously, every time Tom signed chocolate, he was given a Smartie. But now Smarties are no longer delivered. So over time, we're going to see Tom signing chocolate less and less. So that's an example of extinction. Our second example, your son screams in the car when they want you to turn the radio on. You used to plead with him to stop screaming. Now you give no response to the screaming and he no longer screams. Our third example, Jenny tantrums at restaurants when she's ready to go home. You used to pick her up and leave the restaurant when this happened, but now you stay at the restaurant and continue eating. So in the future, we would hope to see that Jenny's tantruming would stop or go down, decrease, and eventually stop. Because that reinforcement that was previously provided for that behavior, in that she was removed from the situation, is no longer being provided. Okay, so some key differences then between reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. So reinforcement comes after the behavior and increases the likelihood of the behavior occurring in the future. Punishment comes after the behavior, but it decreases the likelihood of the behavior occurring in the future. Extinction happens when reinforcement used to follow the behavior and is now no longer available and the behavior decreases. Okay. So if we look at the principles of ABA and how we apply them every day in Snowflake School, So firstly, we would identify how a behavior was learned and why does the child continue to engage in it based on environmental factors. So we're going to pay specific attention to what we call antecedent and consequent events. So that is what happens just before behavior and what happens just after. And we'll go into that in more detail in our second presentation. We also use the basic principles of behavior to make decisions about how we can increase desirable behavior and decrease undesirable behavior. And also, based on these principles, we would describe and implement different procedures. And what's very, very important is that in order to monitor progress and to know if the procedures are actually effective, we record data and we graph the results frequently. So we're going to move on to now verbal behavior. So verbal behavior is behavior that's reinforced through the mediation of other persons. So it included any spoken or non-spoken form of communication that helps people to get what they want or avoid what they don't want. So, as some of you will be aware, Skinner wrote the book Verbal Behavior in 1957, offering a behavioral interpretation of language. Okay, so he suggested that there's two general functional classes of behaviors that lead to reinforcers. Acting directly on the environment, so behavior one does for him or herself, and the other is mediated by the behavior of others. So the latter being defined as verbal behavior. So behaviors that lead to reinforcers that are mediated by the behavior of others. So when we talk about Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, then he argued that rather than language being something that's innate, cognitive, as a lot of traditional theorists thought, he suggested that language is a learned behavior. So he said that proposed that language is best explained by the same environmental variables that explain all other behavior. So, verbal behavior is best explained by the preceding environmental stimuli, so what we call antecedents, so what happens just before, and stimuli that follow it, so what happens just after, what we call consequences. So, what's really, really important when we're talking about in verbal behavior is that a word is defined by its function. Okay, so what impact does it have on the environment rather than its form or what it looks like? So if we're talking about the word sweet, what is the function of that word in a particular context? So is someone using the word sweet in order to get access to a sweet? So they're asking for a sweet? Are they telling someone else that they see a sweet? So what is the function of that word rather than just looking at the word as a whole? So in verbal behavior, language is classified into four fundamental functional categories, and these are known as the verbal operants. Okay, so the four type of verbal operants that we will be covering are what we call the mand, the tact, echoic, and intraverbal. And these verbal operants are really, really important for you to be able to identify. You'll hear us using these terms all the time in Snowflake. So we'll go through them one by one. So the mand. Mand is a verbal response consisting of a request for some object or action, i.e. a specific reinforcer. So the requesting or demanding is controlled by a specific relation between the motivating antecedent and the reinforcer. Okay, so what's really, really important when we're talking about a mand is that there has to be motivation there. Okay, so when we're looking at the antecedent, so what happens just before the behavior, which is the mand, there needs to be motivation. So let's go through a couple of these examples here. So in our first example, a pupil is hungry and wants a biscuit. Okay, so you can see in this antecedent here that there is motivation. Okay, so the pupil mans or requests biscuit. And what is our consequence? The consequence has to be directly related to the motivation. Okay, so the consequence in this example is that his tutor gives him a biscuit. So he gains access to the biscuit. Our second example, so there's some bland, you're given a plate of food and it's very bland. Okay, so there's motivation there to make the food not bland anymore. And you mand past the salt. The consequence then is directly related to the motivation. So someone in your environment gets the salt and sprinkles on your food before eating. Our third example then is you need to get to work and your phone is missing. Okay, so you're motivated to find your phone. So you ask someone, where's my phone? And someone in your environment says, your phone's on the nightstand. You find your phone and you leave for work. So, really important takeaway in terms of whether something is a mand or not is motivation. So, for it to actually be a mand, the individual has to be motivated for that particular reinforcer, whatever it might be, whether it's an item, an action, or some information. Okay. We'll move on to our second verbal operand that we're going to cover, and that's the tact. Okay, so tacting is naming or identifying objects, actions, properties, etc. So commonly just known as labeling. So labeling things in your environment that you can experience through your five senses. Okay, so either you can see it, you can feel it, you can taste it, etc. Okay, so you're labeling something in your environment. All right, so if we have a look then in terms of our uh, examples here. So our first example, there is a dog present at the park, and a little girl says, dog. Okay. And the reinforcing consequence then is that the mother says, yes, sweetie, that is a dog. Okay, so if we have a look here at the difference between the tact and Amand, is that there's no motivation necessarily for the dog. Okay, so there's something in your environment. The little girl is labeling what she sees in her environment, and actually, the consequence doesn't have anything to do with the dog. It is socially mediated, so it's coming from another person, and it's unrelated to the tact itself. Okay, so this is socially mediated positive reinforcement, which means that something is added to the environment mediated through another person. In this case, it's verbal praise. Okay, so the mother says, yes, sweetie, that is a dog. Whereas if this was a man, the little girl would say dog because she wanted to either maybe go up and say hi to the dog or pet the dog or something like that. In this example, the girl was simply just labeling the dog, rather than there being motivation for the dog. Okay. Our second example, so a car zooms past you and your son on the road. The tact then is yellow car yellow car is going fast. And the mom says, that's right, the yellow car is going fast. So again, there's something in your environment that you're labeling, and the reinforcement that's given for that behavior is not related necessarily to the tact itself. It's socially mediated, so it's through another person, and in this case, again, it's verbal praise. Okay, let's move on to our next verbal operand. So, our next verbal operand is echoic. And just like you might think, echoic is just simply repeating exactly what was heard. So, it's also known sometimes as verbal imitation. So, if we're talking about our antecedents, then the teacher says truck, our echoic or our behavior is going to be that the pupil repeats exactly what was heard and says truck. The reinforcer then is that the tutor says, well done, and gets the truck out of the bag and maybe gives it to the pupil. Okay. So again, it might be that the pupil is now getting to play with the truck, but there wasn't motivation necessarily for the truck. That's why it differs from a mand. So if we're talking about an echoic, we're going to have someone in the environment who says something, the individual then repeats exactly what was heard, and the reinforcement doesn't necessarily have to be related to what was said. So it is socially mediated, so it's provided by another person, but it doesn't necessarily generally have to be related to the echoic itself. Okay. So another verbal operant that you'll hear us talking about is intraverbal. So intraverbal really is the basis of conversation. So it's answering questions, fill-ins, or having a conversation where your words are controlled by another person's word. Okay, so if we have a look at the antecedents then for in our first example. So someone in your environment asks, "How are you?" and you say, "Good." And the reinforcer there is that the person replies, "Cool." Okay. So your words are controlled by another person's words. So you wouldn't have said good if someone didn't ask you how you were. The reinforcement then again is socially mediated, so it's provided by another person. It might be verbal praise, it might be that you're given access to something that you really like, but it's provided by another person, and it's not necessarily related to what was said. In our second example here, so we're singing with the pupil, and you say twinkle, twinkle, and followed by a pause, and the pupil says little star. And you say, amazing singing, how I wonder what you are. Okay, so again, you're not going to say little star if someone in your environment hasn't said twinkle, twinkle. So your words are mediated or controlled by another person's words. So in our third example, we're practicing WH questions with the pupil, and we ask, what's your name? And the pupil says, Felix. And we say, that's right, your name is Felix, and we give the pupil a token. Okay, so again, the reinforcement is socially mediated because it's delivered by someone in your environment, but it's not necessarily directly related to what was being said. Okay. So some other verbal operants that you will hear us talking about is listener responding. So listener responding is simply the listener responds to the request of another person in the form of an action. So essentially you follow a direction from someone else. So someone says to you, high five, and then you give them a high five. So someone gives you a direction and you follow that direction. So that could be, can you go and get your coat from the coat hook? Can you come and sit down? Show me your nose, things like that. So you're following an instruction. Motor imitation then is the listener copies the movement of another individual. So the tutor says, copy me, and stomps his feet, and then the pupil stomps his feet. Okay, so you're imitating another person's movement. And the last skill area that we're going to cover today is visual perception or matching to sample. So the listener sorts and matches items that are similar. So maybe you're working with the pupil and you say match and hand the pupil a picture of a dog, and the pupil matches this picture to another picture of a dog. So that's an example of visual perception matching to sample. Okay, so that's the end of our first presentation. So some of the things that we covered in this presentation is what is applied behavior analysis? What are the basic features of ABA? What are some of the basic principles of ABA? So we covered reinforcement. So something is either added to or taken away from the environment that increases the future likelihood of that following a behavior that increases the future likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future. We covered punishment, which is something is either added to or taken away from the environment that decreases the future occurrence of that behavior. An extinction then is where reinforcement was previously provided for a behavior but is no longer provided for that behavior. And that behavior then is weakened or disappears completely. We also had a look at what is verbal behavior. We went through some of the verbal operants, so mand, which is requesting, tacting, which is labeling, echoic, repeating someone else's words, intraverbal, which is responding to the words of another, so a conversation or a fill in or answering a question. And we also took a brief look at listener responding, so following someone else's instructions. What I'm going to do is actually have a page where there's some links to some YouTube videos that go through some of these basic principles that you can have a look at also.